You've developed a strong interest in Baltic region over the years. Where did that interest begin, and what was the first drew you to countries like Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia?
The interest comes directly from my wife. Her mother was Estonian, and she fled Estonia in September 1944 in front of the Russians. Mm-hmm. She was a member of a large family. Her father was the mayor of a town called Viljandi in Estonia, and her family suffered from the Soviet occupation. My wife's uncle was shot by the KGB in 1941 because he had been organizing an election slate, so-called election slate, mm-hmm. of the Soviet elections in 1940. And he was interrogated by the KGB. We've looked at the files of that interrogation, which was a terrible thing. And as I say, he was then shot. My wife's grandfather was deported with his wife to Siberia, where they died in Siberia. So after I met my wife, of course, I was very much aware of this. And what was so striking was the history. It was very difficult in the UK to get a real history of what happened at this time. There weren't what you might call serious historians. There were propagandists mm-hmm. of one side or another. But to try and establish what really the facts had been very difficult. So ever since I've met my wife, so that means 43 years now, I have been very interested in this question. So when we then had the chance with Professor Brendan Sims to set up a program on this matter, which we did in early 2021, we'd actually started with an online event during COVID on the 80th anniversary of the Soviet takeover of the Baltic states in 1940, when there was a lot of interest. So we thought, could we run this program? And we did. And we started it. We had the launch event in January 2021. And the President of Estonia joined that, the Foreign Policy Advisor of the then UK Prime Minister, and some distinguished academics. And we decided to start the program from there. But that's where my interest comes from. It's not my personal family, but my wife's family. And it was, of course, a dominant aspect of her life.
Thank you for this historical overview. It's fascinating because you have a direct contact with the historical side through your wife. And thank you for mentioning the program in Cambridge University. How do you think the opportunities of cooperation could go on in the future in terms of research and cooperation between institutions like Lithuanian Institute of History?
Well, when we decided to set up this program, we had no resource, no nothing. We had to raise money for what we did. And we knew that the academic strength at Cambridge University in this field was very limited. Baltic studies, Scandinavian studies, are not studied at Cambridge University, or for that matter at Oxford University either. It's a shocking truth that that's the case. So we knew if we needed to develop academic strength, we should form partnerships and collaborations with universities in the Baltic Sea region. And so we reached out to a number of universities in the Baltic Sea region, here in Lithuania, first with the University of Vilnius, but similar universities around the region, to see if they would be interested in a collaboration with us. And they were very interested in a collaboration with us. And we've gradually built that network up to about 26 universities across the Baltic Sea region. So here in Lithuania, Vilnius, of course, the Institute for Lithuanian History, the Klaipėda University, and Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas has recently joined our network. And with all of these, we are looking for academic and research collaborations, collaborations around organising events, including the very good event which took place here in the Institute for History in May. And we've found a great deal of interest in our activities. We have the events in different ways. We try and bring scholars from different regions to come to events, if for example, they're in Cambridge or London or in other places. And those partnerships have been very important. In fact, we've really developed our programme on the basis of 3 networks. The first network is this network of universities, where, of course, in those universities you have the foremost scholars of history and in the Baltic Sea region. The second is the UK ambassadors in those regions, who have often been very supportive, for example, providing facilities where we could meet and things of this kind. And then finally, the ambassadors from the Baltic countries in London. And for example, the Lithuanian embassy in London supported an event on the anniversary of Lithuania joining NATO, which we held with the British minister, who was Secretary of State at that time, and with the first Lithuanian representative to NATO. And it was a very good breakfast meeting, very well attended by Lithuanians in London. So all kinds of different events, all based on these 3 different networks. We're constantly seeking to develop our work, to develop our research collaborations, and so on. And then finally, just to say, we've been organising summer schools for students from Cambridge to come to countries in the Baltic Sea region. We've had 2 of those in Lithuania. Our very first one was here in Vilnius, and our third one was in Kaunas. And for the students, they come undergraduates, postgraduates, a variety of different disciplines. It's a complete transformation of opening of their eyes to learn something of the history of these countries. Because, as I say, I'm ashamed to say the level of knowledge and understanding of this part of the world in the UK is far lower than it should be. And so the purpose of these summer schools is, of course, to open people's minds.
The fact that you just mentioned about the level of knowledge about Baltic region in Britain makes me pose another question. How well does the British political and policy establishment actually understand Baltic region and how it sees this region, let's say, as a periphery or a strategic barrier between East and West?
It's a very interesting and a very good question. It's featured in a number of our academic events. How well did the British governing class understand this part of the world? I would say between the wars in the 1930s, the countries here were seen as small countries of no big significance to a big power like Britain. And indeed, there are some quite insulting things written in the Foreign Office archives, the British Foreign Office archives, about the attitude to these countries. There's been a lot written about the process by which the second independence was achieved. We did a lot there, and I think that changed. I mean, it was frankly seen as part of the Soviet Union until 1990. And only since then has a better awareness emerged. I would say in the last 30 years since independence, there is a much better level of understanding, much bigger appreciation, and a number of contemporary collaborations, such as the Joint Expeditionary Force, such as the British forces in Estonia at Tapa. Mm-hmm. There are a number of areas where I would say Britain appreciates far better than it ever did the importance, the significance, the history of the Baltic countries. We've always treated the work of our centre as not only about the 3 Baltic states, mm-hmm. but also about all the countries on the Baltic Sea littoral. And so we've had events in all the countries around because we wanted to see the wholeness of that centre. And of course, it's not only the Soviet history which defines Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, but that's an important part of their history, of course, but it's only part of their history. There are many other dimensions of history. And of course, here in Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we've had a very good event about the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Has its own important historical significance in the development of Europe. So, but I'd say it's really since the second independence that these countries have played a bigger role in the thinking of the UK. We ourselves, our programme has very good relations with the Foreign Office, with the Ministry of Defence, with the Cabinet Office. And you've also got other interesting developments happening. For example, Estonians' experience with identity systems, e-government, has drawn British ministers to come to Estonia and try and understand how they have done this in order to learn lessons. And indeed, the outgoing British ambassador to Estonia has written a book saying Estonia should teach the world a lot, and his book will, I hope, get a lot of attention. And similarly, also with other countries, there's more of a desire to come and learn from, and so not be the great power talking to, but to come and learn from. And I think that's more of a characteristic than it has been.
And more grounded level, after 90s, many thousands of people came to Britain as immigrants, and students and workers, working power. So you could meet a real Baltic person yes. just around the corner.
Very much so. No, the access, the so-called A8 countries joining the European Union made an enormous difference in freedom of movement. And Britain was one of the countries which welcomed freedom of movement from these countries. And as you rightly say, that means that many people from these countries have been working in the UK. That's also helped the economic growth of your countries as people have sent their earnings back home to help the construction of just homes and so on. And of course, the EU membership itself has transformed the situation in terms of infrastructure, paying for infrastructure development in ways which have helped economic progress in a lot of different ways. But you're quite right, it's a very personal experience, and many, many British people can say I've met a Lithuanian, I know an Estonian, in a way that would not have been the case before 2004.
Exactly. Well, you just touched the ground of freedom of movement, and I would like to bring our conversation to wider waters and to speak about Brexit, labour and migration more generally in Britain. And you spent your life in Labour Party, yet many traditional Labour voters supported Brexit. In your view, what were the real political and emotional drivers behind that vote?
I think the absolutely fundamental thing is that in a world where global economy was taking place, large communities got left behind. So, for example, in the northeast of England, coal mining went, shipbuilding went, steel went. None of these, the market had led that, and left behind communities which didn't know what their future was, where it was. And centrist politicians, including people like myself, didn't succeed in putting in place an answer to globalization, that process which led to these enormous changes. As a result, populist politicians were able to arise on the, in my opinion, false basis of saying, if you give us control of this and take it away from this international marketplace, this international economic system, we can bring back things that otherwise have gone. In my opinion, that was always a dishonest thesis. So I don't see the Brexit vote as even a vote against the EU. It was a vote by people saying, we've been left behind, we're being ignored, we want to be heard in our concerns, which of course were genuine concerns. They weren't inventing these things, these were real, genuine problems. And in the UK, that gave rise to the UKIP political party and now the Reform political party. But in a similar way, Le Pen in France was able to develop the Alternative für Deutschland, were able to develop it in Germany. And of course, in America, which was not affected directly by the EU, Sarah Palin and then Donald Trump were able to make exactly that same argument. So I see the votes as a rejection by millions of people of a political and economic system which they believed had failed them, of which the European Union was a part, but it was not the only thing.
Do you think it's only the economical matters, or it's also identity, culture, and...
Well, it's a very interesting question, this. The whole question of historic memory and how that plays itself into contemporary politics is something we've had a lot of events about. In the case of the UK, the fact that the UK was on the quotes winning side, unquotes, in the Second World War, remains a very, very, very important national myth. I don't mean it was untrue. I don't use the word myth to mean that it was untrue, but it is part of Britain's sense of itself that it has been a winner of this historic change. And there was always resentment that countries like Germany, who'd been defeated, were economically more successful than the UK. And that remains a core weakness of British politics, which you can see playing its way through now to this day. Is Britain today a great power in this context? And that makes the process of political consideration of how we deal with these things very difficult. Many parties, including my party, the Labour Party, have tried to modernise the concept, have the conversation not about what Britain was doing in 1940, but what's Britain doing in 2020 or 2030. But it's a difficult process, particularly for the older generations, to forget these points.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you're mentioning the future perspective. So Brexit is already on stage for several years, right? And do you believe that any rejoining of the European project is possible in the future, keeping in mind the generational shift and how Brexit is doing at the moment?
Definitely. This government, Keir Starmer's government, is about a process of becoming closer again to the European Union. There are a number of measures, for example, joining the educational projects Horizon, Erasmus, that will happen. Will that include joining the single market, joining the customs union? Not before the next election in Britain, which will be, say, 2028, 2029. But I don't think it's unimaginable after that. But because of the mandate that is given by the referendum, you either have to have another referendum, and politicians are very nervous of going down that path, because the referendum whole process is difficult to be confident that you're taking the right decisions, or you have to put it in the general election manifesto of the winning party, and so it has a mandate that the new parliament is elected on the basis that the elected MPs are committed and have committed themselves publicly to rejoining the EU. Whether rejoining would happen in any case, I'm not entirely sure. It's a difficult question about rejoining. I think it will happen probably in my lifetime, just about. I'm very old, but it's a complicated process because, of course, there are many forces in the EU which don't want to see the UK back in. France kept us out for a long time when we wanted to join in the 1970s.
France is always the case, historically.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's a similar thing to Britain. I mean, Britain and France were the great imperial powers.
Exactly.
And there's always a tension, shall we say, and I won't say rivalry, but a tension between them. So what I'm certain is there'll be a closer UK-European relationship, which will include changing a number of the things that exist now at the moment, and so moving back towards European Union relationships, still closer defence collaboration, which obviously the the Russian attack in 2022 has made that happen in a much more sharp way. But the path of it isn't easy to predict exactly what the form of that closer relationship will be.
The European project is constantly challenged, especially recently after the wave of European elections in Slovakia, formerly in Hungary, then formerly in Poland, then France is always the question in each vote. Do you think the European project in the long term is a sustainable one, or we're tending towards more individualism, national individualism in Europe?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Of course, in both Poland and Hungary, which you mentioned, the electorates have regained some sense of direction in those areas. And the reason is what I said earlier, that the right-wing, I would call them right-wing populist parties, don't actually have a program which is genuinely about improving the circumstances of people living in those countries. And when they're given the power, their failure to do so becomes apparent. I would always say that Europe needs to be very careful about what it means by the phrase you used, the European project. There's a model which really, I think, stems from Jacques Delors, the former president of the European Commission, about a European way of doing things that you apply universally throughout the membership of the European Union. And I think that's quite a dangerous picture because it's about a bureaucratic system, very centralized
and very developed,
which can leave individuals and cities feeling marginalized from this process. So I would say the European project, unquotes, has to be a much more flexible and fluid prospect if it is to survive. I've been disappointed myself that the EU has not been able to include the countries in the Western Balkans. They've been on the door for a very long time, never being accepted. There's always the outstanding question of Turkey, whether Turkey's membership would be permitted. And there are big forces in the European Union who would never permit that. So I would say if the EU is to survive, it has to, as an effective organisation in terms of the concept of a European project, it has to work out better ways of making it go. So, for example, if you look at the current challenge of Ukrainian membership of the EU, which is something much to be desired in geopolitical terms, the fact is its economy, its agricultural economy, is so enormous that it's quite difficult to see how the current agricultural rules of the European Union, which were designed to benefit our old friends the French, can be sustainable if Ukraine comes into the European Union. So the EU itself has to become more flexible if it is to be able to continue the drive towards a European project.
What about the role of US? Because US is also a challenger for a European project, and evidently Donald Trump is not a great fan of European Union and not believing into what Europe is doing, and constantly saying that Europe is not doing very well. So maybe it's the force that what might help just to restructure and to say that no, it's not the...
Well, it could be, but the thing is, Donald Trump will go at some point. But the problem is a lot of people around him, people like J.D. Vance, the vice president, argues, perhaps it's too distinguished a word, argues, makes the case that Europe is not a proper democracy and so on. This is all nonsense and is not a way that you can proceed. But I do think the US drawing away from Europe gives a big challenge to the EU as to how NATO and NATO too, as to how they are developed. Look at it this way: if Europe is a great regional power, then how does it relate, for example, to North Africa or to the countries on the east, particularly Ukraine and Russia and so on, or to the Caucasus? Is it a relationship where it says we, Europe, will take responsibility for relations with this part of the world, and if America's not involved, that's fine? Or are they thinking creatively in that way? And I'm not sure Europe is thinking creatively like that. Europe has to take the opportunity of thinking creatively about what kind of place it's to be, how it takes its world responsibilities more seriously, how it operates, and that's not thought through fully. Now, I say myself that with the important exception of the euro itself, Europe hasn't succeeded in showing the way to genuinely strong economic development. It has some economic strengths, but I wouldn't say it's been as successful in some areas, even as the United States and or China, and it has to become a more economically successful area. So difficult questions like the regulation of AI or of life sciences are questions where Europe is not really on the cutting edge in the way that I think it needs to be in a competitive world economy. And so these are not terrible things. And of course, the EU is a very strong, economically strong part of the world. But I think there are real challenges to the way the EU operates. And that's what gives rise to these ill-informed comments by American politicians about this, not understanding how Europe is going to develop in this way. Even a very strong economy such as Germany has been very dependent on its relationships with Russia and China throughout the whole process in terms of their economic growth. And so where is that going to be? So I would say in Europe there needs to be a really hard thinking about what does the European economy look like? What should it look like? How does it deal with technological change, particularly AI, in a number of ways? And I'm not convinced that discussion is taking place in the most effective way.
Exactly, that's very, very difficult and very broad question. And you mentioned China, and that's one of the key factors at the moment. But as we have a limited time for this conversation, I would like to move back to Britain and use this opportunity as you served as Education Secretary under Tony Blair. And I would like to touch the question about the class consciousness in Britain, about the class society. And looking back, does background still determine opportunity in Britain? And does it change gradually through time?
I think that's not a right view. It's difficult when you look at the previous Conservative governments with Boris Johnson, David Cameron, not to say this because they were both from the school Eton, which is a very elite private school in Britain. But I don't think they were typical of the Tories of today or of the and certainly not generally over the last 50, 60 years. So, for example, if you look at Conservative governments, a significant number of senior offices were held by people from various minority ethnic backgrounds. Rishi Sunak as a Prime Minister, he made money himself, but in fact his father was a pharmacist in Hampshire, and so he wasn't from some great elite family. Britain still has some serious weaknesses, in my opinion. Its private school structure is not a constructive one. Some parts of its university structure, but I would not say that dominates Britain today. The current cabinet, for example, are, I think almost all of them, people who went to regular schools, came from middle working class backgrounds. Keir Starmer himself certainly did. And I think there are throwbacks in parts of the British system to an old way of doing things, but I don't think that's typical of the system now.
What do you think by saying throwbacks?
Well, from the days when you had to have gone to a private school to be a senior diplomat, if you look at the diplomats in this region, for example, British diplomats, they're mostly from very regular backgrounds, what you might call normal universities, and they've made their life through successes in that way. There was a junior diplomat from the British, or not so junior, diplomat from the British Foreign Office, an event we had in the Institute for History in May. Just a very regular person, regular history, no particular airs and graces and background. And I think that's much more the characteristic of the modern Foreign Service and the Treasury in a different way.
But if I picking up it correctly, when you said about Brexit and the reasons of Brexit happening, so with social inequity and feeling of left behind, it also comes from the same source, actually, from that class consciousness, class mobility.
I wouldn't say the same source. Most of the successful generations in running the British society, whether it's government, politics, media or whatever, are university-educated people. I don't by that mean Oxford and Cambridge university-educated people, university-educated people in general. And it is the case in Britain that a university degree is an important stepping stone to allow you to, for example, work in our government's Ministry of Finance or to work in the Foreign Service or whatever it may be. That group is a different group from the group of people who were rejecting the way things were in those Brexit votes and subsequently. They are almost all, and there's quite a lot of polling research to demonstrate this, people who haven't had education after school, many people who left school at a fairly young age. And that university route is an important route to who governs British society. I'd say, by the way, in common with most countries at the moment. I'd say, I haven't studied this in Lithuania, but I would have thought in Lithuania, many of the people who are leading the society in some way or another have had a university education in their going through. Not university, it's not a requirement, but it's something that is there. And I think that's Britain is in that position too. But the point is, it's not the days that you can see in novels and so on of the Oxford and Cambridge elite, the private school elite. Now, as I say, the Conservative Prime Ministers, two of them in a row, David Cameron and Boris Johnson, were a throwback to that 1930s era of having been to Eton and behaving as though it was their club. But that was, I don't think that's typical of the way Britain is.
To answer your question, well, the university degree and the studies, we are very accessible for everyone, and it's quite common sense for whatever you succeeded in school, you will need to get to university at any costs, not lower. So it's for everyone. Anyway, you touched a very important point about private schools. And what's the situation of private schools nowadays? Because, well, historically, we read that it entrench inequality and class privilege, and you mentioned several times it. So how this question develops in modern
Well, I think it's their historic role rather than their modern role.
Okay.
That is the point. And the historic role dominates the way people think about society. But I think it is a historic thing, not a modern thing.
Okay, so there is no problem of private schools at the moment.
No, I don't say that. I think there are some problems with private schools, but most institutions are not giving priority to private schools in where they're going. That I wouldn't say that's true universally. There may be some parts of the City of London where it's still the case, the financial institutions, but I wouldn't say generally that's the case. Universities have just about entirely, for about the last 20, 30 years, been very keen not to give priority to students from private schools. There was a time when they gave a direct priority to students from private schools. So in the 1950s, so I'm not now talking 60 or 70 years ago, there'd be some universities that had direct admissions agreements with private schools. That was a process. That was all that's been gone for more than 50 years now. But a lot of the commentary on it is, and what is written about it, is based on a perception that that's what happens in Britain today, which I don't think is correct.
For the very end of our conversation, let's speak about universities and about the role of universities in this rapidly changing and rapidly developing world. What do you think the universities like Cambridge what role should be taken by such universities like Cambridge?
Well, I wrote
what kind of leadership?
I wrote a book on this 4 or 5 years ago. I essentially argue that in a world of accelerating change, whether it's scientific change, sociological change, military, geopolitical change, how do we deal with this very rapid change? And I believe the universities are the answer to this. A, because they research and understand what's happening, we hope. B, because they find solutions to what's happening, for example, the vaccine on COVID. So when COVID comes, understanding why COVID happened and then finding the solution. Thirdly, because they're educating and training an enormous section of the population. And finally, because they're elevating the spirit of rationality in discussing how the society deals with problems, rather than the kind of Trump-type remark and saying, let's have rationality as a basis of what we proceed. I think universities play that role of facing up to change better than any other institutions, better than governments, better than businesses, better than non-governmental organisations. But, and here is the big but, in my opinion, universities do not do this as well as they should do. They have to do it much better than they're now doing. Universities like Cambridge are contradictory institutions. They've got a large number of really brilliant people who work there, and they are literally finding solutions to some of the biggest problems in the world. If you look at life sciences and health research, which is focused at Cambridge, the fact that we are living longer and so on is down to that type of research being applied to health systems. On the other hand, it has backward-looking elements which believe there's some elite privilege that should attach to them and that should go forward. And that tension is always there. But I would say that Cambridge, certainly, I think actually Oxford, other universities as well, are really trying to be looking to solve the problems of the future. And the biggest danger for the big universities in Britain is to be, in that phrase, ivory towers. People who are looking to themselves, looking at their own privileges and so on, and not looking outward to the challenges of the future. But I would say the Baltic programme, which I jointly lead with Professor Brendan Sims, is an example of an institution which is trying to say we're not self-satisfied about ourselves. We need to have and want to have relations with others in the world. In this case, our network of universities with which we work in the Baltic Sea region. And in my opinion, that kind of approach needs to dominate the way that universities operate to face up to the challenges of the future.
Interestingly, that universities after a long time in modern countries became politically vulnerable. I mean, what you said, the great role of universities, is very hard to connect it to the hearing of politicians, especially in America case, where universities suddenly became not that independent.
Well, I can't speak to the American case, but in my opinion, universities have to demonstrate all the time their value to society. They have no rights, in my opinion, to say we exist, we should be respected for who we are.
For granted.
Just of itself, unless they can say we are valuable to the wider society. If they can't say we are valuable to the wider society, then politicians, but not only politicians, people as well, will say, well, what have they got to do with us? Why should public money support them? And that remains the case. I took through in Britain the big changes on university finance, and the fundamental question was, if a politician had a choice between putting money into primary education and putting money into universities, he would always put money into primary education. Why? Because all of the evidence is that gives the biggest results for improving the education standards of the population as a whole. And so universities have to make the argument that we are worthy of support. And that argument doesn't come from saying we're a lot of good people. It's argument that comes from saying we are contributing to society in certain ways that the society recognizes as valuable. I think that discussion has gone completely out of hand in America. I don't think that argument's gone out of hand in Europe generally, certainly not in the UK. But there's a constant challenge to universities to make the case that they are socially valuable.
So it's not only the question of contents, but also the question of communication and
those two, yes, it is communication, but it's about saying, if a university says, look, we're doing all this, we're doing this great work, and we don't really care what you think in the street, then unsurprisingly, people in the street say, well, sod off. If, on the other hand, the universities are doing this great work, and we think it can help how we live lives as a society, people would appreciate the work that is being done. And that's very much an attitude from within the universities which has to send that message. I think that to the extent it wasn't there before, it's much more there now, and that the positive role is understood.
Great. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
And
very
Saturday
much
morning.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed.